Let's move on to the agenda. Lots to go over. We are going to move forward into just overview of wildfire predictive modeling in British Columbia, and talk a bit high level about background information on P3+ and its modeling. Then what I'm excited to get into is just get into what we have to offer, what we've produced, so our data products and our results. And then that'll be the biggest time in the agenda. Then we'll move into methods, calibration, and tuning of the products, and then touch on accuracy, and then essentially just takeaways and next steps, and then get to the Q&A in the last 30 minutes. Okay, so just broad context on wildfire modeling and what we're talking about in this webinar. So to kick things off, wildfire models help us predict future wildfire behavior. What Holden and I are going to discuss in more detail are really typical representations of wildfire behavior, or units. So things like size of wildfires, intensity of fire, rate of spread, and burn probability. So those are metrics that help us represent different types of wildfire behavior. And we'll talk about those pieces and how they interrelate with one another to produce things like wildfire. The context too here is really important. We're going to be discussing long-term wildfire behavior. So things that really model outputs that represent hundreds, if not thousands of years. We have not produced like near real time or near term response predictions. So for folks out there, it's a different talk. We're kind of looking at what patterns exist on the landscape, and really data that we can use for fire prevention, fire mitigation. The scope that we're using and the context there is the entire province of British Columbia, or 95 million hectares. So hopefully that puts things into greater overall context for where this webinar is going to go. I'll just touch on wildfire modeling in British Columbia, just a kind of a really quick history, recent history. So the Provincial Strategic Threat Analysis Dataset is and has been one of our primary fire model outputs for British Columbia, and essentially there isn't other publicly available data sets that are at scale, at the provincial scale. And although it's free and publicly available, and I think many people here in the audience frequently use it, some pieces that I think are not ideal are that it's irregular. It's been irregularly updated. The last production was in 2021, so that's now 5 years ago. The PSTA system was built on VRI or PSTA field type data, so those are essentially polygons. The polygons, when they're output into fire model outputs, don't represent spread within or between polygons. And as far as I know, we haven't seen a publicly available accuracy assessment of it. So that's a quick sort of touch on BC's wildfire model history. So now we're back to poll everywhere. I know some people came in later. I would encourage you folks that came in later to please sign up for poll everywhere. So I believe you can use the QR at the top right, use your phone, QR in, and it should prompt you to a name. And then at that point, you should be able to provide responses, although we're not getting any responses. Oh, you got a response. Amazing. Keep them coming. I'm having trouble keeping up. Oh, by the way, for folks out there, you can upvote or downvote these. So what we have at the top, we have BC Wildfire app. Somebody said none. WUI mapping, threat, fire weather, PSTA. We've seen PSTA show up a little bit. I think strategic threat is probably related. Okay. Yes, and then we have some secret models that are being used. Okay, I see a lot of PSTA and definitely the BC Wildfire Service app. So that's great. Thank you so much. Thanks for using the polls. We'll definitely have some more. Oopsies. Okay. Okay, so why did we go through? Why did I invest in this big project, and why did my team endeavor on this? The big why. The big why is because for the work we do in wildfire prevention and fuel management, fire management, we need up-to-date, the most up-to-date, and hopefully the most consistent and accurate wildfire predictive data that we can get. Secondly, we need to base all of the work we're doing, and a lot of folks out there as well, trying to use the best threat and risk data to really lay the foundation for our recommendations, whether you're consultants, your government people, your emergency managers. I believe that these decisions should be based in a quantifiable estimated risk assessment. And those should be used to make those decisions, or at least base your decisions off of. And then finally, I think the other big why piece is we want to provide the public with the best information that we can, and the best answers we can. And I think part of that is the public wants and needs this information. They want to be able to believe it. They want trust in it. And I think the public can tell if data is not accurate or is not consistently built. So there's a need for the public to have understandable and well communicated data as well. So moving on to like why we produced it in-house, and why it may be of interest to all you folks too that are out there. We built these data sets so that we can immediately serve our clients and colleagues. We can provide better consultation and more rapidly with more confidence. I think that's a key piece. But what's great is we've produced these data sets for the whole province. So now with our existing and future clients, we can just start using the data, which is really fantastic. The other piece is that now that we have a system in place, we can start really looking at rerunning these models and rerun them with future climates that we know will need to happen, and we're actually getting kind of that demand from different community forests and different groups. Then there's also the pieces on changing fuel types, and we know with just given our recent fires or forest health problems or cut blocks, these models should be rerun at a frequent pace if possible. And then finally, we want to understand the reasons for the different fire behavior outputs that we're getting at these different locations. So having this information, we can start to look at potentially what regions or communities are more at risk from weather-driven fires, or potentially fuel-driven fires, or topographically driven fires, and also the inverse of all that. So yeah, I think those are really key pieces. So before I kind of conclude and let Holden take over and really show you all our data products, I want to go over really just how much effort and how much, just some big highlights on what we've done to get here. We began this work and this research and development back last year in April, and we've just recently concluded. So everything you're going to see is essentially everything we've done in the last 9 months. This work was solely funded by Frontera. We just wanted to get going and get this produced, so we just did it in-house with our own investment. For this project, we actually had to purchase 2 advanced computers on top of the existing kind of infrastructure we already have. Those were purchased specifically to run all these models. We ran the modeling for three and a half months actually, and yeah, it required some patience because we were very, very keen on seeing what was coming out of it, but we practiced a lot of patience, and we think it's really been worth the wait. Finally, for big picture outputs, and Holden will go more into the details, this resulted in 1 million plus modeled fires, and essentially across British Columbia, we digitally burned down British Columbia over 5,000 fire seasons. Those are some pretty big stats. And I think without further ado, I will stop sharing and turn this over to Holden Payne, our wildfire analyst.
Sweet. Thanks, Nick. And thank you for that intro. So yeah, as Nick said, my name is Holden, and I'll be walking you guys through what we've put together here today. This has been many hours in the making, so I'm really excited to share some of that stuff. So let me just get this all set up. Sweet. So let's start kind of off the bat with a bit of a background here. So a background on Burn P3 Plus, which is the model that we use to develop this data set. It's a model that links a fire growth model, so something like Prometheus or Celta Fire, if you guys are familiar. So that's any fire model. This tells us about how big fire area will get under certain weather and fuel conditions, with a probabilistic fire, series of fire regime characteristics. So like how long fires are going to burn, where they're going to burn, and when they're going to burn. And this model is pretty cool because it uses Monte Carlo simulations to iterate over thousands of fire seasons. So like Nick said, those kind of digital fire seasons that we can create given our understanding of, landscape patterns of weather and climate and the type of things that drive fire behavior. And these are also called iterations. So for this, for this project, we burned over 5,000 fire seasons, enough to achieve, a good stable model. And our model was really, really fine scale. So we have data on every cell is a hectare in size, which means we have data all across BC at the per hectare scale, which is really, really fine, which is great. And I think it builds upon kind of prior approaches both in BC and in Canada and internationally. Burn P3 has been used nationally for a national map of wildfire risk and hazard that was done in 2024 by folks at the CFS. And they did it a little bit broader and a little bit coarser scale, but have it all over Canada, which I think is really cool. And on top of that, there's some regional and local examples out in Ontario and then the Yukon and then even in southern Vancouver Island where they try to capture some of that, landscape scale fire behavior pattern in coastal forests. And then there's been a similar approach down in the States as well with the National Wildfire Risk Maps in the US by Joe Scott and others in 2020. So this approach has been, burn probability modeling has been used for some time and is a way that we like to try to, describe landscape scale fire behavior and predict upon it. So a bit of an overview of Burn P3 Plus, and then I'll jump straight into results. So Burn P3 Plus takes in landscape inputs that are just like raster scenes of your fuels. So in this case, the Canadian Forestry Fire Danger Rating System's fire behavior prediction system fuel types. And so, the types of forest that we tend to find here in BC, and then your terrain, your fire and weather zones. So different areas, of the province and different areas of your subset of an AOI might have different types of fire behavior, different disturbance systems, fire maybe a surface fire here versus ground fire here, and then different weather zones. So we were experiencing different weather that's usually linked to, things like elevation or topographical influences. So all of those are going to be stratified within the model. And then we have ignition probability surfaces. So we can predict on our landscape where we think ignitions are more likely and by cause. We have areas where human ignitions are going to be more likely, typically closer to settlements or closer to cities. And then lightning ignition, on the other hand, harder to predict, but also there are some patterns related to terrain and the types of trees you would have, and then, larger scale climatic influences. And so the benefit to what Burn P3 does here is it takes all those landscape inputs and uses them as a template. And it then processes all these fire regime characteristics over that template. So it, iterates over different numbers of ignitions you might have in your area per season. So maybe this year we have a big season, we have 10 different ignitions, or maybe next year we only have one, or the year after that we have 100 ignitions in our zone. And it samples from those distributions and to try to get an understanding of the variability of fire behavior. And it's going to do that for, the count of ignitions, the days of significant fire spread. So, how long are fires actually spreading for? Are these fires that are burning for 3 days or 4 or 2 weeks or 3 weeks? And then also how many hours per day are these fires burning? And so over those templates, it's, essentially pulling from these distributions and running all these different, probabilistic scenarios to try to capture as much of the variability in fire behavior as we possibly can. And then finally, what you get out of that is really, really nice and useful, aggregated outputs and also individual outputs. So we can pull out individual fires that we burned in the model. We have over 1 million of them. So we could pull each of those out and see where they started, where they went, how fast they grew each day. We can also pull out fire statistics, so how big are those fires? What were they caused by? But I think the most useful outputs, and for our purposes, is we can aggregate those outputs into burn probability maps. So we can, those red splotches right there on the map, we can build them on top of each other. And that tells us about, how likely burning is on our landscape. We can also pull out of those, mean, median, or percentile values for any given fire behavior variable. So we could pull out, the rate of spread value for a particular cell. How fast were all the fires that were burning over that cell moving? And then how intense were they? Were they, are these crown fires that are burning over that cell? Or are they surface fires? And that gives us a good idea of not only where are fires more likely, but also what they do when they burn in those areas. How do these fires behave when they move up a certain slope or down a certain valley? And a bit of a more background on burn probability modeling. So it's calculated as just the number of times a cell burns divided by the number of iterations. So if we aggregate all those fires perimeters and we grow them, like you can see on the right, and then we just add up the number of times that burns and then relativize it. It gives us an idea of the relative probability of burning on our landscape. So it's important to think of it as a relative value. You have to make sure you're thinking about it, depending on how big your landscape is, it's, compared to other parts of your landscape. And I'll get into how we, created a connection across parts of BC so that we made sure we could compare around the province, because that was really a crucial part of this project was, can we compare, how likely fire is in the Northeast to how likely fire is in the Southeast interior or in, the Southern interior or in the Caribou or something. And burn probability maps can tell you about the likelihood of a fire in any given season, but, should be a relative value. And essentially what they're doing is just, adding up these perimeters. So if you guys look at that nice little graphic on the right, those are just individual fire perimeters. And as more and more and more fires grow on top of them, we can see that certain areas have a, higher likelihood of experiencing fire. And that doesn't necessarily mean fires are always starting there, but it means they could start somewhere else and spread there, or they could start in that area and spread elsewhere. But a high burn probability value in this area would be, here there's a lot of like added fires on top of it. And so now that we have the background out of the way, we can go straight into the results. So let me just move this over for y'all to see.
I think we have a poll everywhere.
Great. Oh yeah, poll everywhere first, you're right.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so before we show you results, let's do a quick poll everywhere. So based on what you saw in the webinar thus far, and then also your understanding of fire behavior, if there are some people working in fire management or wildfire service, where do you think fire threat is worse at the moment right now in BC? Where do you think we expect big fires? Where, certainly this year and last year, where do we think areas we're going to burn hot? Wow, a lot for the Kamloops already, a lot for the Caribou. Okay. Some for the coast. That is surprising. Okay, nice. Yeah, a lot in the Caribou. Cool. Okay, I'll give everyone like another 10 seconds to see if we get any more comments. But it seems like most of the Caribou and the Kamloops and a little bit up in PG. Expected more in the Southeast. That's kind of surprising. Okay, cool. So it seems like there's some general agreement on where people expect, extreme fire behavior in the coming years. Certainly what we've seen over the last couple of years and what we might see this coming summer. But I will jump straight to the data now so that everyone can get a look at that. So this is kind of our chief output that we want to share with y'all today, as a result of our model. And yeah, so as I'm getting things up here, feel free to kind of scan your eyes around the province and take it in, see if it jives with kind of what your expectation of fire behavior would have been and burn probability. And so this, image right here is showing you the relative value of burn probability for BC. And so it's scaled. And so it's just scaled to our maximum here. We think that's the cleanest way to show it. And so it could be interpreted as the annual probability of fire in any given year, because we ran a bunch of what we understand to be appropriate fire seasons. And, a value of 6% means you may have a, 6% relative probability of fire here compared to other places. You could also think of it as in terms of fire return intervals. So a 5% annual probability of fire would mean one fire every 20 years, which is pretty frequent. That means pretty frequent return intervals for fire. And you can see we're really finding, extreme and large increases in burn probability, particularly in the Caribou, much like a lot of y'all pointed out, and down in the southern Rocky Mountain Trench and the southern and southeastern interior as well. We found that our maximum was 6%, which was that kind of 20-year return interval, but 95% of the province has return intervals of greater than 100 years. And again, those are kind of averages. So there are a lot of areas where we expect, much higher return intervals. Like in here, it's 20 to 30 to 40 years. And down here in the central interior and even the southern interior, much more frequent. But if we take an average of areas where fire is a lot less common, like up here in the Northwest and parts of the North, kind of more the North, closer to the Boreal, where it's less common, even if they're bigger, we take an average of those, then the province is, not as flammable maybe. So regions, we found that the Chilcotin Plateau in particular, especially the Caribou region, we had 10% of kind of all of our fires burned in the model, kind of burned in this broad area. A lot driven by ignitions in spring and then big summer fires and then larger fall lightning fires. We had higher probability of human ignitions than we kind of expected in this area, but I think that's kind of consistent with, the pattern of human ignitions expanding those fire seasons out. So happening under more mild conditions because, as people like to enjoy and recreate, that just kind of blows those fire seasons out a lot longer than we would expect. And then we also kind of took away that the Northeast, a lot of that burn probability is essentially being dampened by big burns. And that doesn't necessarily mean, we aren't factoring in the potential for reburn, but because we tried to account for recent burns, we're finding that the likelihood of, future large fires tends to decline, because these areas are so big. Those big grayed out areas of extremely low probability or nil are not zero, but essentially the model, after it achieved stability, found that it's just, it's very unlikely to burn. And we did some modifications to fuels to try to account for some of those changes as a result of big fires. And we'll get into that a little bit later. And this is kind of consistent with a little bit of work that was done in 2025 on how boreal fires and the successional changes post-fire influencing, future burn probability. And this was consistent in our analysis. And then we also found...
You're at about 10 minutes, Holden.
Cool, thanks. And then we also found, increased burn probability related to dry conditions in the trench, especially the Rocky Mountain Trench, and then, conditions related to drier interior weather, and then greater burn probability relative to the area around it here, which is kind of this coastal transition zone. So Pemberton, as you get into the interior, parts of Whistler or Merritt that we, found were higher than maybe we would expect and kind of folks would expect in kind of near coastal zones. But I think everyone can kind of maybe attest to, if they've walked on the ground in Pemberton or Whistler, just how much drier it's been. And in the interest of time, I will keep moving on to our other fire behavior outputs, but I wanted to give lots of time for kind of our main results. Up next, I have our, our raster output of the predicted rate of spread for all across the province. So this is the 90th percentile rate of spread. So how fast are fires moving under 90th percentile conditions? And kind of immediately, I'm sure your eyes are drawn to parts of the Northeast where, kind of the maximum of our data set, we're getting close to 60 to 100 meters per minute under 90th percentile conditions of rate of spread. But despite the fact that we have areas of elevated rate of spread, especially in those kind of more flammable C2 boreal fuels that experience those big runs driven by extreme fire behavior, we really only have 25% of the province that predicts rates of spread above 10 meters per minute. Most of the province was below that. And we also found increased rates of spread in the south as well, but kind of driven by... And I think one of the benefits to this type of analysis on top of what we already did is we can pull out the data here and say, okay, what's driving increased rates of spread, in this part of the province and down here versus up in the Northeast. In the Northeast, it's probably extreme fire weather, contiguous fuel types, contiguous fuel scapes, versus down there, it's probably slopes, interaction between slopes and wind. And then, certainly in the southern interior, more open stands, grass fire moves quite a bit quicker. And so knowing what is driving that type of, extreme fire behavior can help us predict, how do we better manage for that? If it's something, up in the boreal with C2 fuels and contiguous fuels, maybe we need to think about, fuel management or something. And if it's a slope, then maybe we consider a different tactic. And then I will move on to our 90th percentile head fire intensity. So this is another output from Burn P3. So this tells us, how likely fires are to achieve a certain, fire rank. So what is a 90th percentile fire rank or value of the energy or heat output of our fires burning across BC? And this data set was also interesting because we found it to be quite a bit more similar across the province than we expected. So most of the province is burning at around a rank 5 fire. So on the upper end of the rank 5, which is pretty extreme, kind of surface to crowning, torching, maybe some spreading crown fire activity. So kind of rank 1 through 3 is anything below 2000 kilowatt is what we consider kind of surface fire activity and is manageable from a suppression perspective, certainly going direct. And then once you get above that, between 2000 to 10,000, you're getting kind of torching to the beginnings of some crown fire activity. And then, past that is when it gets into really extreme crown fire activity. And, where suppression is very difficult, you have mass fire behavior that, is driven by extreme rates of spread, high intensities, super, super large flame lengths, and, potential for long range spotting. And we can see consistent with kind of the boreal fuels, again, 90th percentile high fire intensities in the north are very, very high and significantly higher than we're finding even in this kind of central interior, although it picks up quite a bit in that Chilcotin region again. And then more so down when you get into the parts of the eastern parts of the Rockies as well, the Nelson Cranbrook area, it picks up again. And this data set we found was, a lot more consistent, a lot more homogeneous. Over 50% of the province we figured out was experiencing torching crown fire behavior at 90th percentile, which is just a lot more homogeneous than we expected with those rates of spread. And once we have all those data layers together, we can bring them all together and generate our wildfire threat layer. And so one of the ways that Frontera likes to do our wildfire threat layer is integrate, rate of spread, head fire intensity, and fire behavior to calculate, what is the potential for, bad fire hazard in an area. We do it this way because we think that, both integrating how fast fires move and then also how intense they are on top of how likely they are is probably the best way to characterize wildfire threat. And it's just a relativized scale of 0 to 10. And we kind of will consider different landscapes and fire behavior and then decide upon, what levels are moderate versus extreme versus high threat, low versus moderate versus extreme versus high threat. So the maximum for BC that we got is a value of 8. So it's not actually relativized to 10 here. To get a value of 10, you would need to have the highest burn probability, the highest rate of spread, and the highest head fire intensity in one area. And, we didn't find that in our model, which I think provides some interesting components about how fires are interacting on our landscape. So most of the province is moderate, which is, I think, one of the benefits to this is that we think it probably characterizes fire behavior a little bit better than some of the other approaches out there. But also, over 7% was high and extreme of the province, which means we certainly have some areas that are concerning from a fire behavior perspective, on top of having just a bit more variability in wildfire threat than some of these other data sets. So the 0 and nil values, kind of as I mentioned, essentially means like we don't really have a lot of fires burning in these areas, even though we did achieve model stability. And model stability meaning we burned enough seasons that we're not getting a substantial change in the outputs by adding more. And I think because this is a provincial model, these kind of 0 or nil values are pretty consistent with what we would expect relative to the province, right? We don't really expect fires to be burning very frequently or be very threatening on the coast, as much as it's not as exciting to see areas of less data. I think it is pretty consistent with how we would expect fire should behave in BC. And so kind of our key takeaways for our wildfire threat was that the Chilcotin Plateau is largely the highest wildfire threat and largely driven by high burn probability. So moderate fire behavior, moderate to extreme fire behavior, but a lot of fire happening and frequently, and a lot of overlapping burns. And the Northeast are high threat as well, like I talked about earlier, pulling apart these pieces of the model and deciding what's driving what, can help us better understand how to respond to this. In the Northeast, we have high threat that was driven by extreme fire behavior, not necessarily high burn probability. And that I think is consistent with, how you would understand boreal fire regimes. So longer fire return intervals, but when they, get burning after years of cumulative drought, they really do, like to rip and like to burn a lot. And so understanding that type of threat is very different from maybe the type of threat in central interior or in the Rocky Mountains. Our transition zone also, we noticed quite a big increase in threat. We have quite a bit of moderate to high threat in here. We think driven by a combination of high fire behavior linked to steeper slopes, and then more moderate burn probabilities, not as high as the Chilcotin, but higher than maybe we kind of had expected. And then as well, the southeastern interior and the Purcell Mountain areas and the Rocky Mountain Trends high wildfire threat was driven by, both high burn probability. This is the second hottest place in the province that we found, and extreme fire behavior linked to both, dry winds coming out of the interior and steep slopes, on top of some other things we can touch upon later. And I think what will also be useful from here is to compare this to our PSTA. And so let me just get this up for you guys. So before we jump into threat from PSTA, I just wanted to kind of give you guys an understanding of what goes into PSTA and why we think these data sets are good to be compared, but also to think about, what they actually do. So the formulas are somewhat similar to calculating in the provincial strategic threat versus how we calculate our threat. But the inputs are kind of different. I mean, the understanding is somewhat similar, but they're different. PSTA is a more static approach, whereas our approach is kind of over a range of potential variable conditions. On the left, that's our burn probability value, and on the right is the PSTA's ignition density. And so what this is doing here on the right is taking into account static historical ignition patterns. And the just concern with that is just only relying on past ignition patterns kind of neglects the fact that we have kind of new and more frequent ignition patterns linked to a variety of things that we kind of should account for. And so hopefully including that, not just, ignition patterns, but also burn patterns, in our understanding of wildfire threat, should improve that. And if we move over to the PSTA wildfire threat here, just scaled from 0 to 10, and then including their kind of nil and low probability, and we compare it to ours, we do see a little bit of similarity, which is what we found was kind of interesting, is that, parts of the province that PSTA finds to be pretty hot, like the Chilcotin Lake area, that also shows up in our data set, but there's just more variability in what we found. We found that, areas that are high in our data set are quite a bit higher, and areas that are low are lower. And we think that's useful in a couple ways. I think it's useful to see where areas are, have potentially extreme fire threat. But if you just homogenize the problems and say, everything has extreme high fire threat, then it's less useful to start to prioritize what we're thinking about. And yeah, so just as you guys maybe like scan over these, I'll just kind of walk you guys through my kind of main takeaways from both producing this analysis and also what this tells us about fire behavior in BC. We mostly found that, like I said, burn probability for coastal BC through our analysis, including Vancouver Island and Haida Gwaii, appear to be probably more representative of what we would expect, but maybe lower on eastern parts of the island than people would expect. But I think relative to the province, that's probably pretty accurate, and certainly lower than kind of the type of behavior that is expected under the PSTA system. We found, elevated wildfire threat, largely driven to burn probability in the Chilcotin and the southeast, and those are the two biggest concerning regions for us moving into this fire season and moving into what would have been moving into 2025 fire season, because the way this data was built was on all data up to 2024. And so we actually have a good opportunity to look back on 2025 and say, do these predictions of flammability align with what we kind of saw in 2025? And I think in some ways they did. There were parts of the province like the Chilcotin Lake the Chilcotin area that had 4 to 5 to 6 medium to large fires in 2025, kind of right where we predicted we had the highest burn probability. So that was at least, confirming to me that, maybe this type of relative flammability landscape did a pretty good job of predicting kind of right where we expected. Boreal fires also, I think the takeaway from that was that boreal fires, in big boreal fires in the Northeast continue to dampen likelihood of reburning, but we have to consider holdover fires. So accounting for those things in the model, accounting for mixed severity burns post-fire, and then unburned islands is something we have to continue to think about, even if, we account for those big fires that happened in recent years. But just knowing that they are so large and their successional patterns will change the likelihood of reburning as, time moves on. But they still are threatening. So even if, burn probability goes down, that likelihood of extreme fire behavior is high that you can't really discount that.
So you're a little over time. That's
cool.
Really good.
So let me transition back to the screen. So now we can move back to.
We have another
poll everywhere. So before we dive into methods, I'm going to clear responses and see if anyone changed what they think broadly is the most wildfire threat. It seemed like a lot of people were pretty consistent with kind of what we drew from this, and it doesn't take a model to tell you where you think the fire might be bad in BC. So it's nice to see that those kind of results were consistent. I wonder if anyone, if this jives with expectations of what people found and what people think about moving forward. I'll let a couple answers come in there. A lot for the caribou. Wow, that is confirming. That's confirming to me and confirming to us. Cool. So it seems like pretty overwhelming caribou. So that's kind of nice to see. I don't need to spend much time, and a little bit in the southeast, which I think is, something we've certainly have started to think about as well after this. Certainly I've started to think about as well after this analysis. So let's move forward to methods. So the meat and potatoes of how we actually, generated this data set. Coming at burn P3, you kind of have to get your assumptions out of the way. The model is really only good in terms of how you use it, and if you're really thinking, clearly about the assumptions going into it. So fundamentally, I've come to think of burn P3 as a large fire simulator. So we're only simulating fires under extreme conditions with extreme fire growth and appreciable growth. So that's, there's a model that's built on the spread event day concept, the idea that most of fire growth happens during these big event days. And so fires in the model are only growing on those days. So that's important to think about, that we're not stimulating these, kind of 10th percentile small fires. We're trying to get bigger fires under extreme behavior. And then burn probability tells you about relative landscape flammability, as I said before. So if you break up your landscape into units for processing speed or modeling, as we've done, you have to establish some continuity across those units. So some ecologically relevant variable to connect your units together. Because you can overfit your models essentially, or how I like to think about it is overfitting, if you don't establish continuity between units. And then it can be relativized. And I think the way we've done it is tried to get us to a point where we can say, okay, the burn probability in the Northeast is relative to the burn probability in the Southern Interior or in the Caribou. And I'll get into how we got to that, but that's important to think about. And how we did that was through eco divisions. So we used the BCWS eco divisions that kind of segment different fire season lengths and fire regime patterns.
Holden, you want to share your screen, I think. I'm not sure. Are you sharing this screen that you're on?
Yeah, I think you
Okay.
guys should see the assumptions.
Perfect. Just want to make sure that somebody
Cool.
had a comment about that. Okay.
And so, yeah, eco divisions are what we kind of used under the hood in the model to drive our fire behavior patterns at the landscape level, and it allowed us to compare across the province. And then in this model, again, we must assume fires are kind of non-suppressible because we can't account for modeling suppression in this model. It's a bit of an oversight in burn probability modeling, certainly in burn P3. But if you can account for that error and factored in going into it, I think it can be kind of managed in the model. And I can touch upon how the accuracy and results, how we looked at that. And then finally, burn probability is just the most probable outcome. So it's a relative probability. It's not absolute. It's saying this is the most likely outcome if you've done your due diligence and built a good model, but some things are left to chance. There's, a good likelihood that some likelihood that there's a fire that burns somewhere else that didn't happen to burn in our model. And that's not necessarily because, this is not a good capture of the fire behavior patterns and probability, but just that, some things are hard to predict. And so this was burned, like I said, over 5,000 fire seasons with a resolution of 1 hectare. So really, really fine scale. So that's also why it took so long, but also why we can factor in things like, waterways and roads that would actually limit fire behavior that I think makes this approach pretty strong. So the key inputs and sources into burn P3. So right off the bat, we got our fuels from, the Canadian FPV fuel system. So it was a harmonized layer from BCWS in 2024 and the Ministry of Forest, and also a national fuel type. So we kind of used a blend of those, and then it was modified to account for recent major fire events. So the fuel type changes were based on time and type and time since fire. We work with Dr. Jen Barron out of UBC Okanagan to do that analysis. And so that was essentially changing recent fire areas by fuel type to what we would expect from, kind of broad successional patterns in fuels. And our ignition probability and locations came from machine learning models that were used to predict ignitions by probability and cause. So we have these kind of smooth surfaces of where ignitions are more likely in our landscape for both human and lightning ignition and in all seasons. And these were built on pertinent, influences on ignition causes. So for human, that might be road density or distance to WUI, or we had 10 to 15 different predictive variables. And then lightning, things like terrain and slope and, elevation and height of the dominant vegetation. And this was built from harmonized BCWS and Canadian National Fire Database ignition data. So we brought as much ignition history into it as we could, as far back as 1950, and then tried to harmonize it to make sure we had as much accurate ignition as possible. And then fire weather, and was one of the hardest parts of this, was harmonizing both BCWS fire weather stations and Environment Canada stations with some downscaled climate model fake station data. So we took downscaled data from the ERA 5 land reanalysis data set and created fake stations all over BC. And these were created in areas where we didn't have enough station density. We wanted to have 2 to 3 stations per weather zone within each of our units. We wanted to have good station coverage. And then these were also modified to account for some of the limits on extremes that downscaled weather has. So they were modified to mimic some more extreme weather that we find in relevant stations. And that was and then they were clipped, to represent extreme fire weather following work that was done by Wang and others in 2025. And then this is all data from 2000 to 2024. So we try to get as much weather data as we could, knowing that this is more extreme fire weather. And then our fire regime characteristics, again, these are the things that we really had to tune and took quite a bit of work. And this was generated from harmonized ignition data set, so that BCWS and CNFDB data set, and the Canadian Fire Spread Database. So we use that spread database to build our burning hours distribution and our spread event day distribution that goes into the model. So these are 2 distributions or histograms that tell you about, how long your fires are going to be burning each day and how many days they're going to be burning. And that was the bulk of the kind of calibration piece, was these 2 variables. So major inputs into burn P3, we have our landscape inputs, so our fuel types, and then our DEM, that talks about terrain and slope and aspect, ignition probability surfaces, so how likely are relative human ignitions versus lightning ignitions, and these were relativized to the province. So, roads that, cut through borders in our different modeling units would, apply equal relevance across these units. So you can look at the landscape ignition probability of all of BC, not just per unit. And then in the model, it takes a list of weather data, extreme weather, that I talked about earlier, and then also our wind grid. So how does wind interact with the terrain all across BC? Does wind, increase upslope, or is it decreasing down a valley slope during certain, heating or cooling periods? And so accounting for that is crucial for kind of how Prometheus, which is the fire growth model, tends to burn fires in the model. And those are those fire regime characteristics that I was talking about earlier. So the burning hours distribution that tells us how many hours per day are fires burning in our model, and then the spread event day distribution, so how many days are our fires burning for, and then finally ignition count distribution. So this is how many individual ignitions you're having per unit per season, and these are all sampled from for every iteration. And so if you sample, from enough of these distributions, you get a good idea of the kind of range of variability of fire behavior for your landscape, and you can then, theoretically get a good, accurate prediction of burn probability based on those. And these can also be stratified by cause and season. So we have daily burning hours for different seasons and for different causes, and same with spread event days. So I want to dive a little bit into the life cycle of ignition in Burn P3, just really roughly, just so people have an understanding what's actually happening under the hood in the model. So per iteration or per season, it samples a bunch of ignitions. When it finds an ignition, it says, okay, we're going to burn 10 fires this year. Is it human caused or lightning caused? If it's human caused, okay, where is it more probable, or where are we going to sample this ignition? And then an ignition point is given. And then from there, it samples from our burning hours distribution. So it says, how many hours are we going to grow this fire each day? Let's say 3 in this scenario. And these distributions are built on peak burning hours. So we know that, fires can grow much longer than 3 hours. They can grow 24 hours if the weather conditions are right. But we're burning kind of under peak conditions with peak spread event day conditions. So you don't want to grow fires for, over 8 hours or something. And then we have our spread event day distribution. So we sample from that. We say, how many days are we actually burning these fires for in the model? And then each day, fires will essentially grow day by day that number of hours using a series of extreme weather variables that the fire, uses each day to get bigger and bigger. And then at the end, you can aggregate that output and you would get a final fire perimeter. And then if you burn all those fires that you had sampled for over your fire season, you aggregate those perimeters and aggregate your iterations, then you have an understanding of, what type of fires you're actually burning, and that's how we get our burn probability. So back onto methods more broadly. So how did we decide to process all of British Columbia? And this is kind of what I talked about earlier, that eco-division approach. So we used BCWS's eco-divisions that we split to allow for cross-provincial comparisons, and they were used as calibration groups. So we have individual units within these eco-divisions, but all the units within each, same eco-division had the same set of fire regime characteristics. And the idea is basically like if you break up the province into units, but you don't provide some ecological tie between the two, a border between units that has different characteristics is an arbitrary border. It's a processing border, linked to computation speed. It doesn't actually tell us about fire behavior. So you have to have some kind of ecological framework, we think, to kind of merge these things together. So this is how we split the province up. And we split the hexagons to kind of roughly match those eco-divisions. We didn't match the borders perfectly, but pretty much follow the borders so that, hexagons had a majority of their area in each eco-division. And we kind of added another one that had its own set of calibration unique to its area because we found some kind of different fire behavior. And so that area we're kind of calling a transition zone. So it includes parts of the Lower Mainland, kind of Whistler area, and then into parts of the interior along with the island. And that area was just calibrated individually as opposed to a part of either the coast or the interior because we were finding kind of differences in ignition patterns and fire behavior as we were going through this model. And so then these units were then reapplied their eco-division value. And so a hexagon in, let's say, the continental region would have the same fire regime characteristics as all other hexagons in the continental regime because we would expect fire behavior to generally behave the same in these areas. And the benefit to that is we can test 1 or 2 units using the full fire history distribution in these zones, but then we can not have to basically calibrate all of our units, but then can test that calibration back on the history data set per eco-division rather than overfitting each unit with its own fire regime characteristics. And the way I like to explain this,
Hold on, just a 10-minute warning for the end of the 60 minutes.
Cool, great, okay. I will move quicker then. So, broadly tuning hexagons, I might breeze through this just so that we can get kind of to the accuracy assessment, but, you model a bunch of fires, you create these distributions of fire regime characteristics, and then we essentially just try and run the model again and again and test the sizes of fires that come out of this distribution and see if they match what we found, accurately throughout our historical fire database. And if they match well, then, the model's doing a pretty good job of predicting the type of fire sizes. And that's kind of the way you calibrate these models. But since this was calibrated at the eco division level, these levels would be applied to the eco division writ large based on the calibrating units. And so we are actually kind of, as the model was running, testing against the historical fire kind of constantly. I will skip the poll then for now in the interest of time. So let's go straight into accuracy assessment. So quality control, why is it important to be accurate? And then, how did we think about accuracy? A lot of burn probability and simulation modeling, when they're published, there's kind of less on the accuracy side. There's less histogram comparisons. We thought it was really important to kind of display how well we were predicting fire and how well we think these actually work. A lot of the results will just show a burn probability map, and you're kind of just supposed to assume that this accurately predicts the type of fires and the fire behavior we would expect, but we think it's important to kind of demonstrate it. And our key takeaways we found is that we have really good accuracy all over BC. One of our relevant variables was kind of a mean relative error prediction, and we had less than 30% across BC, which we think is pretty good. And then better for lightning fires than for human fires, which we also think actually speaks really well to how this model is set up and what we can actually predict in the model. And so better predicting lightning fires, which is the thing that we know the model is better at anyway and is built to do, is actually good because it's hard to predict suppressible human fires. And then by eco division, we also had some variability. We had strongest areas were in areas with most fire, which is good. So the continental ecoregion, kind of that Caribou central area, parts of the Rocky Mountains, the semi-arid steppe or the southern interior was also strong. And then the boreal, the northeast, was very strong, which we felt lined up pretty well with us. So how do we actually assess that accuracy? And I kind of mentioned this before, but if you guys are not familiar, it's essentially through kind of some visual matching techniques between fire history histograms, so your distribution of your size classes. So how much fire is in each of your size classes, and you would compare what you got in the model with what you found historically. So these are kind of subjective, so you can change your variables and tune them until you kind of match what you expect. And then our predicted mean, median, and 90th percentile fire sizes, so are those characteristics matching what we'd expect? And then this was a method that we came up with as part of this process. So if we can calculate the mean relative error or the relative difference between individual fire size histogram classes and average it across the distribution, we can get some idea of basically how far away our distribution is from what actually happened in history. So I'm going to sit on this graph for a second because I think it's kind of one of our best results. And it's essentially the comparison of fire history distributions for our entire model. So this is all of BC and all fires greater than 10 hectares. Our model burned fires, pretty much all fires. So in our model, we actually burned all fires greater than 1 hectares because I wanted all fires to burn, essentially to see the full range of distribution of fires. But then we're only testing on fires greater than 10 because we're not really concerning ourselves with fires that are really small. We want to at least get some appreciable level of growth. And some people we'll cut these models off at 50 or 100 or 250 and say those are large fires. We decided to go on the smaller end, although not all fires. So what you're looking at here with the green graph is the historical distribution. So those are the relative proportion of sizes of fires in each of those classes. The blue is going to be the modeled fires that were produced as a result of burn P3 in this analysis. And then the red is fires that we're calling a spread event day data set. So this was a created data set that includes all fires that started under spread event day conditions and achieve some spread event day growth. It's a weaker data set to compare to because it's a little smaller and it relies on some weather data, but we still thought it was good to tune our model in between the historical and in between the spread event to get the benefit of the accuracy with the historical data set, but also know that we actually want to plan for spread event fires. So we kind of want to be somewhere in the middle, and that's how I tried to tune our model. And what we found was pretty good. As you can see here, that our model actually kind of under predicts small fires, which we actually think is okay because we kind of want to predict larger fires. We think that's probably more accurate for risk planning. It tends to over predict in some of these kind of medium-sized fires a little bit, and we think that's due to the influence of the suppressibility of human fires in real world, that some of these fires that might have grown here that would have been human are suppressed out. But it does better in larger fire size classes, especially medium to large fire size classes. It matches spread event day fires pretty well. And then a little bit of an under prediction in the biggest fire size classes. We think in large part because of kind of mass fire weather and extreme fire behavior that's kind of hard to predict on a this type of model. And the benefit to this, it's just that you've got to calibrate your models to get an accurate output. So you have to really make sure these things are finely tuned. And I want to acknowledge folks at the CFS who gave me a lot of help and a lot of advice on this as well. So thank them for that kind of calibration help. And then the benefit to this approach is you can also stratify by human and lightning, and we could see that the error in our model, so where our model didn't do as well, was mostly in those human fires, and we actually think that's a good thing, because I think that tells us that we're predicting the type of fires that Burn P3 does a good job predicting, and that this effect here, wherein we have more medium to large fires in human ignitions, is probably a suppression effect. These fires are in real life are probably more close to settlement. They're probably happening close to the WUI, and are probably being suppressed out before they would maybe get to the size. And so it's something the model can account for. And so since that error is being sopped up by the human ignition, it means that we're probably doing a very good job, and we were doing a much better job with lightning ignition fires. I'll give you guys another second just to take in that graph, because I know I threw a lot of numbers and a lot of graphs at you. And then if we look at the fire characteristics as well, we can pull out the median and the 90th percentile fire sizes. And so this is all fire history data in our data set and all fire in the model. So over 1 million fires in the model, and then all the fires that have burned in British Columbia in our data set. And we find that we are like really close to what actually happened in real life. Our median is just slightly over predicts by 10 to 15 hectares. Over predicts a little bit on historical fires, but in the context of fire size, it's not that great. And then for 90th percentile fire sizes, which are the fires we're certainly concerned about, we are really, really close to the historical data set, which is really good. I think we're only 150 hectares off from the historical 90th percentile fire size for the entire province. And then you wouldn't compare to the spread event day fires here, because spread event day are already 90th or extreme fires, so that would be the 90th of the 90th. But the fact that we're so close to the historical fire 90th percentile size means that I think we did a pretty good job of capturing the types of fire sizes that we were expecting anywhere in BC. And we can also pull these out by eco-division and compare them by eco-division, and we're able to find where our models were strongest and where they were kind of lacking more across the province. Yeah, so I think if I have time for this poll, I'll give y'all just a second to respond to that, so that I would see if people are kind of interested in using these predictive outputs for your community or landscape, or if people are thinking about applying them themselves, or talking to us, or if this hopefully gives some people who are involved in the fire management world more confidence, I think, in this type of approach as well. I think the amount of time we spent on accuracy and calibration was in large part to improve confidence in these types of approaches, so that we know this is like another tool that needs a lot of thought into it, but if it's done well, I think can improve accuracy assessments and fire management planning and all that stuff. So a good amount of very much, I like to see that, and then some interested, and then some not sure. Hopefully we'll get some good hard questions in the Q&A section.
We've got a lot of questions, actually.
Whoa, okay.
Very good ones, yeah.
Okay, so moving on. Nick, do you want me to turn this over to you now?
Sure, why not? Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Holden. That was a lot to cover, and I had to tell everybody we had a lot to say. Do you mind keeping your screen up, Holden?
Sure thing.
Might be easier. I just want to touch on the provincial takeaways. So overall, like some main messages, if you were to take anything from this, is the project's data products, we think, provide definitely a more up-to-date data set when compared to PSTA, because they're essentially good up until the end of year 2024. And really just they're an alternative. It's a comparable data set, and they could be used, our Burn V3 outputs could be used with PSTA to complement that. We also realize and are ready to take feedback from you folks and potentially look at more analysis and continued accuracy assessments really at the community and regional levels, and I'll get to that in a second. We know there's just so much more to learn and obviously things to improve upon. I think that's the final piece, is that we're going to keep fine-tuning these things here at Frontera and improve the inputs as well. Can you go to the next slide? Great. In terms of kind of business related things, we end up kind of working with our community. We're interested in working with you. So you guys out there in the audience, if you are a potential user of these data, or if you're some of those people in the poll that were like, not sure, interested, that kind of thing, I want to hear from you. So please email me, nsoverel@fronterasolutions.ca or info@fronterasolutions.ca. We can discuss providing a data set for you or your community or your area of interest. And what we'd ask though, if we do go ahead and do that, that we get your feedback, like what are you finding with the data? Is it resonating? Is it accurate in your opinion? Yeah, so definitely interested in continuing this conversation and kind of working together after the webinar. And you will be receiving an email after the webinar, both about this topic, but if you go to the next slide, this is a two-part webinar series. So we have a webinar number 2 coming up on May 7th, same time, 1300. And it will be titled Wildfire Threat Data in Action, a community level perspective. And what we want to do is take what Holden just went over at the provincial scale and just zoom in on Whistler and zoom in on the Cheakamus Community Forest. We've been doing a lot of work for them for about 4 years. And we want to use the threat data we've discussed and talk about ways in which we visualize that data and look at ways we can project that in terms of a risk assessment. So you will also be receiving an email invitation to webinar number 2, so stay tuned. And that actually concludes the whole presentation, and I think it was actually exactly 60 minutes, which is pretty impressive with, I think, everything we did. And I want to say thank you to you, Holden, especially really, really great job with a lot of, just a lot. So, oh, we're getting some claps. We got a clap. Oben. Oh, we're getting more claps. Okay, great. Let's get right into the questions. I think, Oben, if we can we do the digital chat ones and then kind of go back and forth to folks out there?
Sure. And just to confirm, you wanted to start with questions from the beginning.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. A question from Kyle Gillich. What fuels data are you using, and any concerns in quality of fuels data?
Good question. Definitely concerned.
Let's keep the answers succinct, just because we have a lot of questions. Yeah.
Yeah, concerns with fuels quality. Definitely, I think anyone who's used fuels at the provincial level has concerns about quality. We're using BCWS as fuels. We did some modifications based on some of our work. So some fuel typing we've done on top of kind of what I mentioned with post-fire modifications. And then concerns about the quality. Yes, I think that the reason the model did very well despite some of those fuel quality errors is because, as I said ahead of time, Burn P3 is a spread event day model, and so it's really predicting fire behavior under extreme conditions, wherein bottom-up controls on fire behavior are less important under extreme conditions. So if we have, 95th to 99th percentile wind speeds and extreme ISIs and FWI values, those limitations on fire behavior from fuels are less apparent and less pronounced. And so since we're burning extreme fires, those controls are laxed, which is why we think even if there are some errors in fuels, the results were better than we thought because of that kind of extreme fire behavior overriding maybe those fuels influences.
Next question.
Next question in the chat is from Jessica Hawksworth. Does the model account for fuel changes over areas burnt on previous model runs, or run every scenario from the baseline fuel grid?
Every scenario is run from the baseline fuel grid. So it essentially, like, we're trying to mimic each season as its own individual season. It's not accounting for the reburn potential. That would be closer to like a fire regime model or like a succession model almost. Burn P3 is more about like landscape flammability. So where in any given season would fire be likely right now with all the data you have leading up to that moment. So it's kind of clean slate and then burn and burn and burn.
Oben, I think we had a hand up. Somebody have a hand up? Maybe you can just speak. I think Jessica Shoebridge, maybe. Speaking to the big audience out there. Okay, maybe not.
Sure, yeah, I'll keep an eye out. The next question in the chat is from Flor Tirabelli, sorry. How do you define weather zones, and are you using spatial weather data?
Cool. Yeah, I hope that method section covered that a little bit. We used weather zones from the BEC system. So there's kind of 1 to, I believe, 15 or 14 different weather zones across the province. And then we tried to, and then those zones would have individual station data. We're not using spatial. Well, we did use spatial weather data from that climate downscale data set, but it was used to create fake station points that were sampled within weather zones. So the weather itself is at least it's point data, and fires that burn closest to a certain weather station are given that weather, but it's non-spatial, i.e. it's not surface weather, except for wind, which does account for changes in surface topography, etc. But say like relative humidity for a fire area would all be the same, but the wind would vary with fire area.
Great. And similar question from Kyle Corrigan. What sources are you using for weather data inputs into the model?
Data comes from the Ministry of Forest Fire Weather Stations, so that's the FLNRO stations, and then Environment Canada raw stations as well, and then the ERA 5 land reanalysis. So that's that downscale climate data that I mentioned.
Right on. Next question from Mike. For this burn probability map output, how should we think about the connection between any pixels burn probability and predicted fire size?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have thought about that one, Mike. I would say the hard part about linking those two is that burn probability could be where fires are burning into all the time. So it could be like a sink area of fire. Then an area could not necessarily have a high ignition likelihood, but could have a high burn probability. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that area is always going to have a big fire size. It could be small fires. Like if we, in the southern interior where we find that, fires are smaller but more frequent, burn probability probably doesn't tell you that much about fire size. So I think you have to think about it in the context of your landscape. High burn probability in the, the Caribou or the interior, the Chilcotin is probably linked to medium to large fire size, and same with the Northeast versus the interior.
I'm curious with Mike's question, if maybe, and Mike, you could even continue talking, is like determining almost like a ratio of, there could be determine like an index of probability and size of fires, like combined. Like,
we've got a hand up from Sarah. I'm not sure if Mike's still with us.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so I guess my question, I was looking at that map and saying, okay, probability, what does that mean in terms of tangible fire effects? What is the landscape scale risk of, a large breakout fire where we know when fires are larger, they become more intense in the core, you get larger areas of higher severity burn with larger fires. That's the pattern. So perhaps something like that index would be interesting. I think this is maybe a good step in the direction of being able to describe that to practitioners to say, okay, as your fires get bigger, the risk gets higher.
Yeah. Holden, I was just going to say that we've talked a little bit about like the fire spreadability metric, and I feel like that goes a little bit to a Mike's question, where it's like, what is the likelihood of that pixel of contributing to a fire of a certain spread size?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that is a really good point. And Mike, I like your kind of tie into that. I think you could also get to that by pulling out the fire sizes from the model around burn probability and seeing what types of fires are growing, how big they are in areas of high burn probability. That would tell you more about, is burn probability driven by a lot of frequent fires that are small, or is it driven by less frequent fires that are larger? And then, what are the spreadability of those?
And that's also probably something that's more relevant at, the sub-ecozone scales, perhaps more for a check-in-this community forest client, for instance, they may be interested in that wind risk for their region. It's harder to get that at provincial scale.
Well, we better keep going because we do have more questions. I think we have about 10 more.
Yep, no problem. Question from Kevin Crease. This was around 1:30, so I'm not sure the context. It says, is this assuming without suppression?
Yes. Yeah, the model assumes no suppression. You can change the minimum fire size in the model if you say that we assume all fires under 10 hectares are going to be suppressed out. That is kind of the very coarse knob that we have to control suppression. We tried to avoid that route because I think that'd be really hard at the provincial scale to decide what the suppressible size is at any given part of the province. So our goal was to say, let's just burn all fires above a certain size and then analyze the accuracy above another certain size, and then kind of assume that we can't really capture suppression well. So might as well just factor that into our analysis after the fact.
Right on. Next question from Lachlan. What validation have you performed on this model? Is there a control data set or comparison to historically observed burn probability?
Yeah, I think we kind of answered that. Hopefully, answered that in the accuracy session. So hopefully, those graphs. That's kind of the best way we assess accuracy. You could also compare to. You could create a spatial burn probability off of the observed fire data set. So you could take existing fire perimeters and generate some understanding of burn probability from the existing perimeters and compare it to our data set as well. You just need a lot of fire history. That's kind of the limitation on that. Is if you don't have that many fires, you don't live through a fire regime, you don't fully understand what our expected fire return intervals are. So it's hard to do a spatial comparison.
Okay, I've got a two-part question from Sohail. I'll start with the first one. Did you also take into account changes in fuel or fuel types over the years driven by growth and mortality?
No changes from growth and mortality. The fuels would be up to date as far as 2024. So we assumed, what exists on the landscape in 2024 was what we used. The model doesn't model succession or successive fire years, so we wouldn't do growth or mortality. For the weather, that would be, I don't know if you asked already, Holden, but I'm reading it here. The weather, that'd be current weather up to 2024. So 2000 to 2024, which is, I would also argue, is more extreme weather than the kind of full fire history would experience. So we're already giving it kind of more extreme fire weather, but have not fed it future climate data. But that is a method that we've used before in other projects. So you can feed it potential climate modified weather to predict the types of burn probabilities and fire areas you would get under a particular climate scenario. And that's something we've used before.
Awesome. Moving on to the next question from Kyle. What is the simulated burn window for each iteration in terms of length in hours and time of day?
Good question. So yeah, that's that fire regime distribution that we showed you. So we have a distribution, so a full histogram of burn hours and then a full histogram of spread event days that the model used. And that was built off of real fire spread database that was published in 2025. And so we use that to build a distribution of hours. So it's not just 1 hour. It would be each fire samples from that distribution and says, okay, maybe I'm burning for 3 today, but the next fire I'm only burning for 2. And that gives you a better understanding of the full range of kind of potential burn conditions that you might get.
Right on. And Harry asks, were results on Vancouver Island affected by available data on private forest land?
Yeah, really good question. We obviously could not get up-to-date data on private forest land, so we had to use available public data that was available to us. So one of the drawbacks is kind of limitations on private data would be a drawback of the model.
And Lachlan is looking for just more information on your 90th percentile calculation.
So 90th percentile, I'm assuming you're talking about weather, but I can do it for both because I only kind of mentioned it for rate of spread. Well, rate of spread and head fire intensity is where I mentioned 90th percentile. So that is the 90th percentile rate of spread of a given cell on your landscape. So for all of BC, we have the predicted 90th percentile rate of spread. So all the fires that burn there, what's the 90th percentile fire rate of spread for that cell? Same for head fire intensity. So you can pull out the mean if you want. We think it's better to predict the 90th percentile rate of spread just because that's kind of what's typically done in fire management, but you could pull out the mean. And then the weather data was not 90th percentile. It was extreme weather linked to spread event day conditions, and that was regionally calibrated. So across the province, there's been a couple papers on like what weather is conducive to spread event day conditions. And so we filtered our weather data by weather that was conducive to extreme fire behavior in each area of the province. So rather than just cutting it by 90, because some areas of the province, extreme weather might be lower than 90, other areas it might be higher. So we want to capture weather that's connected to fire behavior, not just to 90th.
Okay, great. Another question from Kyle. If you will be using this for public funded contracts, will you be providing full detailed methodology to those clients?
Can I answer that one?
Yeah, please do.
So at this point, we've shared actually, I'd say, a chunk of the methods, like right here in this recording. I'm not really sure what detailed methodology means, but I think to broadly answer this question, as I said at the beginning, this all work was funded under Frontera. So yeah, we essentially built everything. So we would not be sharing like every single piece of the methodology to any potential client. But we're trying to be transparent and trying to definitely get feedback and continue to work with other consultants and researchers in this space. So definitely want to keep the conversation going. Maybe I'll keep going. I think opens offline. So next question from Jessica Hawksworth. You seem to be showing threat on private land. Have you run into any pushback yet from landowners? So to answer your question, Jessica, we haven't worked with any landowners. We essentially just finished the project in February, and now we're working to just try to improve the data sets and just get feedback from people. So we haven't experienced this yet. Next question, Jessica again. Are you intending to be sharing your screen again? Okay, well, I think we handled that one. Sarah Smith Tripp, next question. This is for you, Holden. How do you define season?
Yeah, seasons were done by Ecodivision. So I came up with the season start and end dates of our 3 seasons for everywhere in the province, and not every part in the province had 3 seasons. Certain areas only had 1 or 2 seasons, and that was done by looking at fire behavior, ignition distributions, and ignition counts throughout the kind of full potential fire season. So really from April, they didn't all start in April, but really from April all the way into like October, November, I looked at how are ignition patterns changing? Are there distinguishable periods in each season? And then those were stratified by Ecodivision. So regime characteristics stayed the same in Ecodivision. So like the continental interior had the same season start dates for spring, summer, fall. All hexagons did in there.
Thank you. Oh, that's a thumbs up from Sarah. Great. Next question from Flor Tirabelli. Burn probability is the number of times pixel burned divided by the number of simulations or years simulated.
Yeah, number of times that a pixel burned divided by the number of simulations, so the number of iterations, so the number of fire seasons.
Great, thank you. From Angela French, often provincial funding eligibility for wildfire risk reduction is contingent on PSTA threat risk mapping and or BC Wildfire Service endorsement. How will this data integrate?
Maybe you want to answer that.
Yes, so Angela, this data, again, it's brand new. We are getting feedback. We aren't working with the provincial government on this, neither the Ministry of Forest nor the BC Wildfire Service. So we don't know yet. We would need to talk to those government bodies and work on that. So stay tuned. Yep. Next question. Kevin Crease, what is the area you would most like to focus on for improvements in the future?
Yeah, good question, Kevin. Yeah, I think improving fuels data is one. Getting over the kind of private land, kind of ironing out the private land issue is another. Really ironing down the fire weather as well, kind of getting more station data, improving our station data. And then, yeah, just now that having learned kind of how this went through is just redoing it and testing it again with kind of new fuels as we understand it today and seeing, is this continuing to predict accurately? So I think those are the kind of key parts.
I want to make a plug with what you just said, Holden. I definitely agree with you. I think fuels is an area where there's a lot of improvement needed. And in webinar number 2, we will be looking at a LiDAR-based fuel type input for the Burn P3 system in Whistler. So we'd love to have you, everybody here, but Kevin in particular, to see what we've come up with. And we actually will have some model outputs from Burn P3, from a different model output using a LiDAR fuel type attribute. So that actually concludes the questions from the chat box, but we still have 10 minutes. So I would definitely be happy to keep the conversation going. And we just got another question from Yusuf Ali. Are you interested in academic collaboration? Yes, we definitely are. We are actively collaborating with researchers on this call, Sarah Smith Tripp, and I think Mike Stefanik is still here. So yes, very much. And maybe Yusuf, you could let us know what university you're from or what your academic background is. In the meantime, if there are other questions, feel free to unmute and or add questions in the chat box. Sarah.
Hello. I noticed that there, like in the poll, quite a few people said, well, a lot of people said interested. Some people said very interested, but there was also a group that said not interested. I'd be curious for people that are still on the call and still engaged, how did you define your interest levels? And like, what was going into that decision?
This is the poll here talking about.
If anybody would be willing to share.
That's a great question, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. And we'd love to talk about that. It's actually one of the purposes of the webinar is to try to shore up people that are uncertain. Okay, we just got a question. Can you see the question, Holden? I'm in like Google Meet.
I think more just comments in the chat, less questions.
I think Kevin just raised his hand though.
Oh yeah, Kevin, go ahead.
Sure, I'll go. I'll answer. I'm interested. I think Sarah knows that. But I guess part of my question is, maybe it's to the question why people aren't interested. It doesn't seem like BC has a culture of using tools like this, particularly for landscape level planning. Like most of the people are driving this only into WUI CRR planning. So it seems to me like what we got is a gap just in manager understanding of the importance of this. And there's a lot of talk about prioritizing treatments and we don't have enough money. I just don't imagine how you can do it without tools like this. So, good on you guys for doing it, but I think there's a bit of a problem with the manager community at some level, not recognizing that they just can't do the vision of landscape field management BC without some kind of these kind of tools. So maybe this is an observation, but also I think I wonder if you guys are engaged in this. This feels to me like an effort for you to raise awareness of the importance of the tools and sort of show some of its potential applications to that broader landscape, and maybe a comment on that.
Yeah, I think that resonates for me, Kevin, for sure. I might have been actually at a workshop with you last year when I kind of thought of this concept, which was doesn't matter what the workshop was, but somebody put a slide on a screen that showed PSTA data in the WUI, a big pie chart. And it showed, pretty much half of all of our WUI areas in the province were high or extreme. And I was just looking at it thinking like, that just doesn't seem right. And it's not, and actually after over a decade of using the same data sets, shouldn't we be doing better? And that really is kind of where this at least came from for me. And I do hope that this, the goal isn't to say that some other data set is wrong and shouldn't be used. It's more about advancing all of our knowledge and working together to try to really solve really difficult problems. And I just think hopefully this will resonate with those folks who, from the BC Wildfire Service that are in the predictive services realm, are interested and can, work with Holden specific, on technical outputs and next steps. And I'm curious, even within the BC Wildfire Service, is there kind of an update to PSTA coming, or if there's another system that will be developed? That would definitely be, good to know. And
Yeah, I see some comments on in the chat about two, and maybe one that Nick wants to handle, but at least one I can handle on inputs and parameters. And yeah, I think making some of this publicly available as well, which is kind of what we're trying to do here, is kind of explain the bulk of the methods, not necessarily give you the exact values we're using for everything, but I've tried to explain kind of how we ran this methodology, how we built our data set, so that people have an understanding of most of what we're doing in as much detail as possible. There is kind of a good bulk of material online about methodology for running burn simulation modeling. This isn't mostly stuff we've come up with. It's largely stuff that we've kind of built off what folks at the CFS have done. So that does exist. I think, which is also why we tried to do this type of webinar, is to kind of get this data set out there so people know these approaches exist, and then here's how we might use it, and here's what kind of it looks like, on top of kind of showing you that we're trying to do some accuracy assessments on them. Yeah, and I can also link some papers that were done by the CFS if people are interested in the chat to read more about their detailed methodology, which was similar to ours, but would give, if people want to read those papers, they're already published.
I can go back to Jessica Shoebridge's questions, which I think are really good. Yes, Jessica, we will be at the next webinar. We will be talking about your community, and yeah, excited about that. But your point or question here, yeah, any way to use this tool to differentiate where prescribed fire versus manual thinning might be more appropriate, applicable, is Mike Stefanik still here? I'm Sarah Smith. I just feel like when we were talking actually about burn probability and fire size distribution, it makes me think that there is a potential for more development with the burn probability data set to look at a linkage to natural disturbance types. And part of that being, as Holden pointed out, the model seems to be, quite good at predicting lightning fires, certainly for those fires that aren't suppressed. So it's actually indicating fire behavior without the limit of firefighters. So I guess, Jessica, the tool really isn't built for using it at that level directly. Like, we're not going to probably produce a prescribed fire versus manual thinning output from this data set. It wasn't built for that purpose, but I do think there's potential linkage to a more highly resolute natural disturbance type data set through this data, potentially. I don't think we had more. Okay, thanks, Holden, for we had a comment about, I think one of the missing pieces here is how to reduce the wildfire risk, like testing different treatments to reduce the wildfire risk of the landscape and focus more on fuel management instead of weather, because we cannot control the weather but can manipulate the fuel at the landscape. So certainly, yes, that supports the purpose of fuel management, but that kind of gets at too, Holden, I know there's some ways in which we can unpack at more of community level. I think we'll talk about it a little bit at webinar number 2 at the Whistler levels, looking at the wildfire threat, rate of spread, probability, and headfire intensity, and drivers of those wildfire behavior outputs, whether it's particularly weather driven and maybe wind versus other weather, fuel driven or topographically driven, depending on where you are in the landscape. So that could even help you in terms of fuel management and what efficacy certain fuel management might have if it is a real fuel, if the causal factor is fuel versus, say, topography, because topography is something that we can't change without huge input. One more comment from Angela French: valuable work, especially how it enables pod planning, probably expanded on in your next webinar, and how fire management planning can be nested within forest management plans. Well, thank you very much. Holden, before people go, can you please put the link? Actually, maybe I can do it. I'm going to put the link to webinar number 2 while that I still have people in the chat box. We aren't going to talk about pods at webinar number 2. I don't want people to get too excited. We just only have so much time, and that might be a separate webinar.
Looks like Kyle had a question. Kyle, feel free to just unmute and jump in.
Kyle, I think now you're muted again.
Oh, hey, sorry about that. You got me?
Yes.
Yep.
Hey, just wanted to chime in. I'm with BC Wildfire Service, and we are working on an updated PSTA that's going to be published later this year. It also has a new methodology, like an updated methodology as well behind it. So,
well, we'd love to learn more about that and hear what the approach is and some of the outputs, and can collaborate on that for sure. I think I'm definitely interested, and I think my team here is as well.
Yeah, certainly. We're still working on kind of getting everything ready, but we'll definitely stay in touch to invite you to the educational events with the rollout of that.
That's exciting.
Will it be using Burn P3 Plus potentially?
It is not using Burn 3P Plus, no.
Okay. Good to know. That's great. Well, we are definitely at a little bit past 2:30. I would love to, I want to say thank you to everybody for sticking around and definitely being interested and being audience members here. And please come to webinar number 2, May 7th, 1 o'clock, 1300. Click on the link in the chat box. Get the conversation going. And thank you to my co-presenter, Holden, Payne, and everybody have a great afternoon.
Thanks, y'all.